Jamal Carter, a 17-year-old black teenager, pedals his bike through the quiet, dimly lit streets of his suburban town. The night air is crisp, and the distant hum of streetlights provides the only sound. His thoughts are consumed by the workshop he just left, his mind spinning with the possibilities for his next painting. Colors and shapes blend together in his imagination, each one a piece of his dreams. Jamal knows that the path to becoming an artist won't be easy, but he feels the pulse of hope in his chest every time he picks up a paintbrush. His family's struggles are never far from his mind. His mother works 2 jobs just to make ends meet, and his father isn't around. But Jamal holds on to something that gives him strength, a belief in himself and his art. He has always believed that his talent could break through the barriers that society tries to put in front of him. As he rides down Main Street, the sharp screech of a car's tires cuts through the night. Flashing lights appear in the rearview mirror, their harsh glare blinding. Jamal's heart skips a beat. He knows this drill all too well. He's been stopped before countless times for reasons as small as walking in the wrong neighborhood or just existing. The car pulls up alongside him, the engine purring ominously. Jamal slows down, glancing nervously at the police car. "Hey, get over here," comes the command. Jamal hesitates for a moment, his pulse quickening. He takes a deep breath, then carefully walks his bike to the curb. Officer Simmons, a broad-shouldered man with a permanent scowl, steps out of the car, followed by his partner, Officer Moore, who remains silent, observing. "What's your business here, kid?" Officer Simmons growls, eyeing Jamal suspiciously. "Where you going?" "I'm just heading home, sir," Jamal says, trying to keep his voice steady. "I was at an art workshop, just going back to my mom's." "Art workshop, huh?" Officer Simmons sneers. "Funny, you fit the description of someone we're looking for." His tone is sharp, like the blade of a knife. Jamal feels the knot tighten in his stomach. He knows this line, he's heard it before. This time, though, the stakes feel higher. "I haven't done anything wrong," Jamal insists, his voice still. Calm, but there's an edge to it now. "I'm just going home." "Yeah, right," Officer Moore mutters under his breath. "Always the same story." Officer Simmons steps closer, grabbing Jamal's shoulder roughly. The force of it makes Jamal's breath catch in his throat. "You match the description. We've got every right to question you. Now get on your knees." The command hits Jamal like a slap. He stands frozen, the unfairness of it all crashing down on him. He looks around, searching for help, but the street is empty. No one is coming to his rescue. "I'm not doing anything wrong," Jamal protests, his voice firm despite the fear building in his chest. "This is messed up. Get on your knees." "Officer," Simmons shouts. His face is a mask of contempt. Jamal's body feels stiff with defiance, but he knows the danger of resisting. He doesn't want to make things worse. Slowly, he drops to his knees. The rough pavement bites into his skin as he tries to steady his breathing. His dignity is being stripped away, but his resolve hardens in response. "That's better. Stay down or we'll make you," Officer Simmons says, his voice dripping with cruelty. The officers laugh and the sound is harsh, a mocking chorus that tears at Jamal's soul. Jamal feels small in this moment, the weight of their words bearing down on him, but in the depths of his heart, he refuses to let them break him. They can take his dignity for now, but they can't take away his spirit. From a distance, a voice calls out, "Hey, someone's recording this!" A figure stands nearby, holding a phone, its screen lit up in the darkness. Jamal's eyes flicker to the bystander, hope rising in his chest. Someone is watching. Someone sees what's happening. But the hope is fleeting. Officer Simmons storms toward the bystander, his face twisted in fury. "Give me that phone!" he barks. The bystander stumbles back, clearly terrified, but Officer Simmons snatches the phone from their hand with alarming speed. "Let's make sure you don't get any funny ideas," Simmons mutters, scrolling through the phone's screen before deleting the video. The evidence of Jamal's humiliation, the proof of their cruelty, is gone in an instant. Next time, keep your nose out of business that doesn't concern you. Officer Simmons spits, tossing the phone back to the bystander, who stares at it, helplessly. With a mocking grin, Officer Simmons turns back to Jamal, who is still kneeling on the ground, his heart pounding in his chest. "Get up," Simmons orders. "You're under arrest for resisting arrest. Put your hands behind your back." Jamal feels the cold metal of the handcuffs snap shut around his wrists, the tightness digging into his skin. His pulse is racing, and every part of him wants to scream, to fight back. But he knows better. He knows what happens when you resist. The stakes are too high. "I didn't do anything wrong," Jamal mutters, his voice trembling with frustration. "Save it for the judge," Simmons sneers, roughly shoving him toward the squad car. Jamal climbs into the back seat, the door slamming shut. Behind him, as the car speeds away, Jamal presses his forehead against the cold glass of the window, his body still trembling. His thoughts race. What now? What happens to him next? His future, his dreams. They all feel so far away, slipping through his fingers like sand. The hum of the car engine fills the silence, and Jamal's mind drifts. He thinks of his family, his art, his life before this moment. But he knows something has changed inside of him. He's been broken down, humiliated in front of the whole world. But he isn't gone. He isn't defeated. This moment will not define him. And somewhere in the shadows, David Reynolds, a journalist who has spent most of his career looking the other way, watches the car disappear into the night. His conscience stirs, the weight of the injustice pressing down on him. He has been complicit for too long. The truth is out there, and now he knows it's time to speak it. Denise Carter's heart raced as she hurried to the police station, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Every step felt heavier, weighed down by the dread that gnawed at her from the inside. Her only son, Jamal, had been arrested, again. She had already faced countless battles as a single mother, but this felt different. This time it wasn't just about Jamal making a mistake or being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This time, it felt like the world itself was turning against him. She pushed through the doors of the station, her eyes scanning the room until they locked on the officer behind the desk. He barely looked up, his fingers typing away with a practiced disinterest. "Excuse me." Denise's voice broke the silence, though it trembled slightly. "I'm here to see my son, Jamal Carter. He's been arrested. I need to know what happened." The officer barely acknowledged her, his eyes flicking up for just a moment before dropping back to his paperwork. "Your son resisted arrest," he muttered, as if the words were routine. Denise's chest tightened at the coldness in his voice. "He's not a criminal. He hasn't done anything wrong. I need to see him." The officer sighed, rolling his eyes before picking up the phone. "Yeah, I'll have someone talk to you," he said flatly, not even looking her way. Denise stood there for what felt like hours, the weight of her son's future pressing on her shoulders. When another officer finally appeared, he was just as dismissive. "He'll be fine. Just a little misunderstanding. He's being held because of the resistance charge. You can talk to the judge tomorrow." "Misunderstanding? You're telling me this is all just a misunderstanding?" Denise's voice cracked with disbelief. "My son is not a criminal. You can't just treat him like this." But the officer was already turning away, uninterested in her protests. "That's what it is. A misunderstanding. He'll be fine." Denise's blood boiled as the door slammed shut behind the officer. Her son Jamal was sitting in a cold, sterile cell, and no one cared. The lies that had been spun about him would follow him, no matter how much she fought for the truth. Back at the station, Officer Simmons sat behind his desk, staring at the paperwork in front of him with a grim satisfaction. He had known from the start that Jamal was an easy target. A young black boy, walking through the wrong neighborhood, doing something as simple as going home. He had been asking for trouble. The fabricated evidence he'd planted was just part of the job. Jamal was an example, and Simmons wasn't about to let him get away with questioning the system. His partner, Officer Moore, glanced at him from across the room, uncertainty in his eyes. "You sure this is the right call? His record's clean." Simmons scoffed, not looking up from the papers. "Doesn't matter. You know as well as I do that we can't let these kids think they can just get away with anything. They need to learn their place." Moore hesitated, his fingers tapping nervously on the edge of the desk. But he wasn't even doing anything wrong. "That's the problem, isn't it?" Simmons sneered. "People like him. They don't belong in neighborhoods like ours. It's about time someone taught him a lesson." Meanwhile, in the harsh, fluorescent-lit corridors of the juvenile detention center, Jamal sat in silence. His wrists ached from the tight handcuffs that had been forced onto him. He had been led through the gates, his body numb as he walked, through the threshold of a world that seemed intent on breaking him. The other kids in the detention center gave him cold, assessing looks, their eyes full of suspicion. Jamal was an outsider here, a boy who had never belonged in their world of cages and hopelessness. But now, he was a part of it, and there was no escaping it. The guards' voices echoed off the walls, each word a reminder of how little control Jamal had over his own life. No matter how much he tried to push back, no matter how many times he whispered to himself that he didn't belong here, it wasn't enough. He could feel the walls of his spirit slowly closing in, suffocating him with doubt. Was this what his life had come to? Was this what it meant to be a black teenager in a world that only saw him as a threat? Jamal couldn't escape the crushing weight of the lies that were being told about him. Resisting arrest, a crime he hadn't committed, but now it was a part of his record, and it would follow him forever. As the days stretched on, Jamal's thoughts spiraled. What was the point of fighting anymore? Every time he tried to do the right thing, every time he tried to prove he was more than what the world saw in him, he was met with cruelty. Maybe this was his fate. Maybe the world had already decided who he was. Outside the detention center, the town's dirty secret remained buried. Officer Simmons had covered his tracks well, making sure that no one would ever question the way he operated. There were whispers in dark corners, of course, other victims who had been silenced, other boys who had been treated like criminals for simply existing. But the system was too strong, too corrupt to care. Every complaint was buried under layers of indifference and bureaucracy, and those who dared speak out were silenced by the weight of the law. The media, ever complicit, spun the story into a tale of misunderstanding. The arrest was framed as a necessary precaution, a routine stop that had gone wrong. No one questioned the truth. No one asked the right questions. They just accepted what they were told. Jamal was guilty by the mere virtue of his skin, and the truth didn't matter. But David Reynolds, a journalist who had long turned a blind eye to these stories, couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. He'd seen the case, just a small mention, in the local paper, but it was enough to make him pause. It was always the same, black boys getting caught in the system, disappearing into a machine that chewed them up and spit them out. For years, David had stayed silent, unwilling to risk his career by confronting the powers that be. But as he looked at Jamal's face in the article, something inside him snapped. This time, he couldn't stay neutral. This time, he had to speak out. He had a platform, and he knew it was time to use it. But there was someone who had already been paying attention. Monica Davis, a black journalist who had long seen the cracks in the system, pulled David aside one day. "You can't keep ignoring this, David," she said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "You have a platform, use it. If you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem." David felt a rush of guilt wash over him. She was right. He had stayed quiet for too long. It was time to make a choice. He set out to find the truth. A lead came to him, a woman named Elena Garcia, who had secretly recorded part of Jamal's arrest. She was scared to come forward, afraid that exposing the truth would put her in danger, but David wasn't going to let fear stop him. "Don't worry," David said gently as Elena hesitated. "I'll protect you. This video, it could change everything. We can't let them get away with this." Elena's hands trembled as she handed over the phone. The truth was in her hands now, and she knew it. She knew the risk she was taking, but she also knew that it was the only way forward. As David watched the footage, he felt a fire ignite within him. This was the truth, and he was going to make sure it was heard. The fight for Jamal's freedom had just begun. David sat at his desk, staring at the screen. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, uncertain. He had written articles about injustice before, but never like this. This wasn't just another story, it was the story. The video footage Elena had handed over to him, the damning evidence that could expose the truth about the officers who had wronged Jamal, was finally ready to be shared with the world. He took a deep breath and hit publish. Within minutes, the article spread like wildfire. Social media exploded. The video of Jamal's arrest, the officers' lies, and their brutality played on every news outlet. People watched it over and over, their eyes glued to the injustice unfolding on their screens. In the heart of the town, things began to change. People who had been silent, indifferent, or unaware before were now speaking up. The truth was out there and they couldn't ignore it anymore. David scrolled through the responses, his heart racing. His words were resonating with people, sparking outrage, demanding justice. But it wasn't just online. The protests began almost immediately. People flooded the streets, their voices rising in unison, chanting, "Justice for Jamal." Denise stood at the front of the crowd, holding a sign that read, "Free Jamal." Her eyes burned with both anger and determination. The pain of the last few weeks was still there, but it had transformed into something else. Purpose. Her son was no longer just a victim. He was a symbol of everything wrong with the system. She raised her fist in the air, shouting alongside the others, her voice carrying a strength she didn't know she had. "We won't back down. We won't stop until Jamal is free." The streets around City Hall were a sea of people, young and old, black and white, coming together to demand accountability. They couldn't stay silent anymore. They couldn't ignore the reality of what had been happening right under their noses. In response to the growing movement, police officials scrambled to downplay the video. They called it misleading, claiming that it lacked the full context of the situation. They held press conferences where rehearsed lies were spoken with cold detachment, repeating the same words over and over. This was standard procedure. The officers acted within the scope of their duties. But the people were no longer listening. The truth was undeniable. The video, the protests, the voices demanding justice, it was too loud to ignore. Officer Moore watched the protests from his living room, the weight of guilt pressing down on him. He couldn't escape the truth. The lies he had helped perpetuate, the injustice he had witnessed, haunted him. Every night he lay awake, wrestling with his conscience. He could hear Jamal's voice, see his face, hear his mother's desperate pleas. How could he have stood by and done nothing? Monica Davis, a colleague of David's, had confronted him earlier that week. "You know what's going on here, don't you?" she had asked him, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "You can either be part of the problem or the solution. Which one are you going to be?" The words had haunted him ever since. Finally, after days of inner turmoil, Officer Moore made a choice. He called David. "I'm ready to talk." Moore's voice was quiet but firm. "I'll testify. I'll tell you everything. Just make sure you protect me. I need immunity." David nodded, the weight of the moment sinking in. This was it, the tipping point. Moore's testimony would break open the case, but it wasn't going to be easy. Officer Simmons was not someone who could be easily defeated. Simmons, on the other hand, was not ready to back down. The backlash against him was growing, but he stood firm, his arrogance unshaken. In a press conference, he dismissed the video as misleading propaganda and sneered at the protests outside. "This is just a bunch of noise," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "The system works. I'm not going to apologize for doing my job. If people don't like it, that's their problem." But the system wasn't working anymore. The cracks were beginning to show. People were no longer willing to accept the lies. The mayor and police chief, under immense public pressure, were forced to act. The mayor called an emergency meeting, his face pale as he looked around the room at the officers and city officials. "We can't ignore this anymore. The public's demands are clear. We need to make this right." The police chief nodded, though his expression was grim. "It's not going to be easy. Simmons has a lot of support within the department, but they knew what they had to do." Simmons was stripped of his badge. The empire of fear he had built crumbled in an instant. As he was led away in handcuffs, the weight of his actions seemed to finally settle in. He had thought he was untouchable, but the truth had shattered his world. Meanwhile, Denise stood outside the courthouse, the cool air biting at her skin. She had been there for hours, waiting, hoping, praying. Her heart beat so loudly she could barely hear the sounds of the crowd behind her. Lawyers were inside, battling for her son's freedom, but Denise couldn't bring herself to believe it was real. Every day had felt like an eternity, and she had been bracing for bad news, not the justice she was hoping for. But then, the doors opened. A lawyer stepped out, a look of quiet triumph on his face. "Jamal Carter is free." Denise's legs almost gave out beneath her. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The weight of everything, the fear, the uncertainty, the anger, lifted in an instant. She had fought so hard, and now her son was finally free. Tears welled up in her eyes as she turned and looked out at the crowd. They were all watching her, waiting. And then, they began to cheer. The voices of the people, her community, rose up in a wave of celebration, drowning out everything else. Jamal was free, and so was she. As Jamal stepped out of the courthouse, blinking against the bright sunlight, he felt the weight of the world lift from his shoulders. The cheers of the crowd filled his ears, but it wasn't just the sound of victory, it was the sound of hope. He wasn't just free from the system, he was free from the lie that had been placed upon him. Denise ran to her son, wrapping her arms around him, and for a brief moment, everything was perfect. There was so much healing to be done, so many battles still ahead, but in that moment, they had won. Jamal wasn't just a survivor. He was a symbol of resilience, of resistance, and of the power of a community that refused to stay silent. Jamal sat in his room, the weight of the world pressing on his chest. The freedom he had longed for was finally his, but it didn't feel like a victory. His mind replayed the flashbacks, the handcuffs, the stares, the humiliation. He had survived the system's attempt to break him, but he wasn't sure how to move forward from the scars it had left behind. He woke up in the middle of the night again, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. It was a constant battle to quiet the noise in his head, to ignore the flashes of anger and pain that swirled in his chest. How did you heal from something like this? How could you ever be the same? Denise walked into his room quietly, knowing the silence wasn't just from the night. It was the kind of silence that comes from pain too heavy to speak. She sat beside him on the bed, her hand finding his. "I know it's hard," she said softly, "but you're not alone, baby. You made it through. They tried to break you, but you're still standing. That's the truth." Jamal didn't speak, but the knot in his throat loosened just a little. His mother's voice had always been his anchor, grounding him when the world felt unsteady. Her strength, her unwavering belief in him, was the only thing that kept him from completely losing himself. He looked at her, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can ever feel normal again." "You don't have to be normal, Jamal," she replied. "You just have to keep moving forward, one step at a time. You have a purpose, and you'll find it." For the first time in weeks, Jamal felt the smallest spark of something. Maybe it wasn't about returning to how things used to be. Maybe it was about finding a new path. He didn't know what it would look like yet, but he knew it was time to let his pain speak. The next day, Jamal picked up his paintbrush. It wasn't immediate. He hesitated, staring at the blank canvas for what felt like hours. But then something inside him snapped. His heart bled into the colors. His strokes were raw, powerful, filled with the rage, confusion, and sorrow he had carried. The image of the officers, the handcuffs, the faces of the people who had watched but done nothing. They all came alive in vivid, jarring colors. He stepped back, examining his work. It was his story, his experience, all laid out on the canvas for the world to see. His pain, his rage, his resilience. Jamal knew this was just the beginning. He couldn't keep this inside. His voice needed to be heard. He took a deep breath and decided to share it. He posted the painting online, along with a message. "They tried to silence me, but I won't be quiet anymore." The response was immediate. It spread through social media like wildfire. People shared it, reposted it, and the movement began. The hashtag, seen and heard, gained momentum, becoming a symbol of resistance, of reclaiming power, of not being forgotten. Within days, people from all over began to share their own stories of injustice, stories that had been buried for far too long. They posted their truths, their experiences with racial profiling, police brutality, and the silent suffering they had endured. And for the first time, they felt seen. The whispers of injustice turned into a roar. David watched as the hashtag blew up across his screen. His phone vibrated with notifications, his inbox flooding with messages from people he'd never met, people whose stories mirrored Jamal's. It hit him like a wave. This wasn't just a news story anymore. It was personal. He felt the guilt settle in his chest. He had been an observer for too long. He had written articles, told stories, but he had never truly seen. Not like this. He couldn't pretend to be a passive bystander anymore. The voices that needed to be heard had been silenced for far too long, and he had a responsibility, no, a duty, to amplify them. David sat down at his desk, determined. His next article wasn't just about the facts, it was about justice. He began digging into the past of the police department, uncovering years of corruption, cover-ups, and racial profiling. The truth had to come out. He couldn't allow silence to complicity anymore. David's latest exposé went live, laying bare the systemic problems within the police force. It sparked outrage, yes, but it also ignited action. The community began demanding real change, change that couldn't be ignored. The mayor, cornered by the mounting pressure, convened an emergency meeting with city officials. The corruption couldn't be swept under the rug any longer. New anti-profiling policies were put in place, the first steps toward reforming a broken system. Officers involved in the cover-up were arrested, but it wasn't enough. The community wanted more. They wanted accountability. They wanted justice. The old police chief was forced to resign, his reputation shattered by the growing pile of evidence against him. In his place came a new chief, one who understood that policing was not about control and fear, but about service and protection. A chief who was committed to fairness, equality, and integrity. And all the while, Jamal's movement continued to grow. What started as a painting had turned into a revolution. People gathered in the streets demanding more reforms, more changes. They had seen the injustice and they couldn't unsee it. They stood together. Black, white, every race, every background, fighting for the same thing, the right to be seen and heard. Jamal knew the work wasn't over. The world still needed to change. But now he was a part of that change. He had found his purpose. He stood in front of the largest canvas he had ever painted, feeling the brush in his hand. His fingers moved with purpose, his strokes steady and sure. The mural he was painting wasn't just for him, it was for everyone who had ever been silenced. It was for his community, for all the victims of injustice, for every person who had been ignored or mistreated because of the color of their skin. Faces of resilience filled the canvas. Fists raised high in defiance, eyes fierce with determination, tears turning into strength. And at the bottom, in bold letters, the message that had carried Jamal through it all. They tried to silence me, but now the world listens. As the mural was unveiled to the community, the crowd erupted in cheers. This was more than art. It was a declaration. Jamal had taken his pain, his trauma, and transformed it into power. He had found his voice, and now the world couldn't ignore it. The fight wasn't over, but Jamal had proven something important. Even when they try to break you, even when they try to silence you, you have the power to rise. And in the end, the truth will always find a way to be heard.